So I guess I wanted to sort of give you an overview of the work of our team in inclusion. So Mia's given the sort of specifics of what the Film Fund does and how that work goes across our production. But as an inclusion team, we sit across all of the functions of the BFI. So we have an archive, there's a library, we're a cinema. We really go across the sort of chain of the industry and reach out to the industry that are making films as well. So I kind of wanted to give you a sense of what inclusion means at the BFI and what we do and why. Oh, no. Oh, there I am. Sorry. So if you think about why inclusion is so important, so you only have to look at the press to see how pertinent this question is when we're talking about who gets to be represented in front of and behind the camera, who gets to be seen, whose stories are told, and who gets to have a career in this industry. And this is important to us because there's a lot of anecdotal evidence of our talent leaving and going to the US because they can't find work in the UK and they can't find the diverse stories or the representation that they need to be able to work. So this is an issue morally, but also in terms of our business. And we have a huge skills shortage at the moment in the UK, so we need to understand why this is and make sure that those opportunities are being given. I've got two things going on at once. It's all very confusing. So I wanted to show you this clip. We did a symposium called the Black Star Symposium as I started at the BFI in 2016, where we talked about some of these issues. And this is specifically about the representation of black actors on screen. But I think what David Oyelowo, who gave the keynote here, is talking about is relevant to these issues of diversity and inclusion. So he's talking specifically about bias and racism and the ways in which it becomes difficult to talk about diversity and inclusion, because the minute that you talk about something like racism, people get very in their feelings and very defensive about that word. But what we're really talking about and what we should be talking about is the right for people to be represented in the culture that we create. So I'll let him speak.
Bias is something we all have. We all have it. To be human is to be biased. The problem with talking about diversity is the captains of industry often think that you are calling them racist when you are talking about representation. The fact that I want to be represented and in some way you feel like I'm saying you don't allow me to be represented makes you feel like I'm personally saying you are racist. That is so far from the truth. Bias, in my view, is exemplified in the fact that about 9 out of 10 of every person who stops me in the street, having seen work that I've done, is a black person. Why is that, you may ask? I know exactly why. Because they are the center of their own life. They are the protagonists in their own story, and so therefore, when they see a reflection of themselves on screen, they instantaneously gravitate towards it. It's their bias. Because when they see me, they see themselves. That's what it is to be human. That's fine. That's not racist. That's not bad.
So it's important that David's talking about these things because he is one of those actors that had to move to the US to have the career that he's had. So he's been incredibly successful, but not in the UK. And in the research that I did for Black Star, which was looking at on-screen representation, he doesn't actually appear in our list of UK films as an actor, because in spite of how famous he is, neither did Idris Elba or people like that. So there's a real issue here for us that we're losing incredible people to other territories and having a lack of representation in our films that we're making. So who are we? This is us. That's me and the Director of Culture Inclusion trying to take over number 10, very necessary at the moment. We caused a riot, let me tell you. So there are, currently we've just grown our team. So Jen is our Director of Culture and Inclusion with more of a view to culture change within the BFI. I'm now the Head of Inclusion, so that's around strategic delivery of our inclusion strategy, but also my interests are kind of around data and reporting and accountability for the work that we're doing and international and academic partnerships. We have a race equality lead, Miranda, who is our inclusion coordinator and events producer, so we like to bring light to the work that we're doing through events. We've just appointed a disability equality lead. So these are our sort of areas of focus over the next few years and where we really feel like we need to push the dial. Who I am. So if you Google me, you can find out that my background is academic. I started off in research. A lot of my research was about representation in what I subsequently realised was an attempt to locate myself as a mixed-race, British-born person in the films and television that I loved so much. So I was constantly talking about Britishness and what that meant because it didn't seem to reflect what I was seeing on screen. So I bring that work to the BFI in terms of data and looking how we can use research to enlighten ourselves about these topics. I'm also the European Council lead for the Gina Davis Institute of Gender and Media, and did the Black Star Project, as I spoke about, so really trying to use diversity data to get us talking about diversity and inclusion from a point of knowledge. So, you know, none of this kind of like, oh, well, that's just one person's experience, it's anecdotal. We can really start talking about there's only 2% of our actors in British films that are black, when there's sort of, 40% in London. That doesn't really make any sense. So that's my interest, is sort of talking from a point of knowledge and reality about the situation that we are and using that knowledge to push us forward. And also, kind of as a side hustle, when I was doing this research, I realised, looking back at the history of the BFI, there are these cycles of kind of representation and inclusion and how we talk about these issues that come to the fore every now and again, and then they seem to drop off and we don't really make any progress. So there was a publication called the Black Film Bulletin that came out of the Afro-Caribbean unit. Yes, there was an Afro-Caribbean unit at the BFI in the 90s. And this publication was really sort of bringing together and really bringing to light the Black British filmmakers that we had, looking at a wider Pan-African diaspora and interviewing those people and bringing their work to light, showing what was in production. And that stopped happening as the Afro-Caribbean unit went in the late 90s and the funding for that went. But I've just managed to bring it back in our Sight and Sound magazine. So there's a little quarterly section where we can bring that representation back. So I talk about that not to just say how amazing I am, but also to talk about how important it is to sort of keep your foot on the pedal of these issues, because it's really easy to slip back and think that we fixed everything. But the data shows that actually everything sort of stays the same and sometimes gets worse. So you really have to sort of keep thinking about how you keep pushing the dial and keep fresh on this agenda. So, what do we do as a team? We like to see ourselves on that track as agents of change and positive disruptors. What we want to do is positively disrupt the status quo. We want to have action, so as much as we like panels and sort of talking about diversity and inclusion, how do we change that into action on what we're doing as a public funder? So what are we doing to make sure that everything that we do represents the public that fund us? We are sources of expert knowledge. So as you saw from my team, there is amazing diversity in the knowledge that they have and the specialisms that they have and how we bring that into our work. And we're champions of the lived experience. All of us have lived experience of discrimination, of living in this world as different people, and how we bring that into and feel that every day in embedding that in the work of the BFI, because it's our experience. So it's not just, nobody wakes up in the morning and thinks, I really want to be a diversity and inclusion specialist. It comes to you because we're passionate about that and we feel that experience every day and we don't want other people to feel like that. So that's really important to remember, the kind of emotional load that comes with this work as well. So I think it's important to talk about what we really mean when we talk about inclusion, because as David was alluding to, there's often a sort of, people are quick to sort of think it's about one thing or another. So it's like, oh, we're talking about women or we're talking about race. Whereas actually what we're talking about are these questions, and these are questions that we ask ourselves every day. What we're talking about really is access, fairness, equity. What we want to do is remove the barriers that make people feel like they can't partake in our culture. And representation, as I was talking about, is really important that people are represented in our industry because culture and film is persuasive. People can see the possibility of who humanity is, what they do, how close we all are through our film culture. So if people aren't represented in that, they are left out, they're excluded from who we are. So it's really important as a publicly funded organisation, as I said, that everybody feels welcome and recognise that they have the right and that we can give them the creation of a lifelong relationship with moving image and storytelling. And what do we really mean in terms of category? So in the UK, we have the Equality Act, which is a very useful framework to talk about the protected characteristics that we describe when we're doing this work. But it isn't a tick box approach. So we're really also thinking about what are the barriers, what are the lost opportunities around people. So that could include, we also look at things like socioeconomic background. If you can't pay to get a train down to London to go for an audition, that is precluding you from being able to partake in our culture. So how do we fix that and assess that need as well? Okay, and these are our guiding principles. So we really believe in changing up the gatekeepers. Off-screen inclusion, we believe, will drive on-screen inclusion because you will have the variety of voices, the stories being told that we want to see on screen, and allows for an authentic portrayal on screen as well, which I think is really important, who's telling those stories. We also believe that great stories have universal appeal, so not thinking about stereotypes and kind of pigeonholing representation into one or two or three or four types of representation about people, but that everybody is interested in every person's story and that all audiences can consume that. Also, thank you, thanks. Was it really obvious that I've got a frog? Also, we're interested in building the skills workforce. As I've said, we have a real skills shortage in the UK. Excuse me, 1 second. Okay, it's not coronavirus, I promise you. So yeah, we have a real skill shortage in the UK, so we really can't afford to be exclusive. We can't afford to not have diversity in looking for the talent that we need because it is everywhere. If we become exclusive about that, we add to the skill shortage, so that's important to us. Access and accessibility, that's not just about physical access, I'm not just talking about disability there, but also, again, this sort of idea of being open as an institution that is funded by the public. Everybody should feel like they have access to us and the work that we do and what we can provide them. And that goes for sort of our digital content as well, sort of what are we curating that everybody wants to see. We believe that talent is everywhere and opportunity is not, so shifting the focus of diversity from diverse people onto us. We need to provide the opportunities to them for them to take part in what we do. And also that there are very clear and commercial opportunities in diversity and inclusion, as has been shown over the last few years. There used to be a sort of assumption that it was very niche, that people wouldn't want to come and watch films with diverse talent in, but that's very much been proven otherwise. If you look at the success of female filmmakers over the last few years, films like Moonlight, which just kind of blew up at the Oscars. I haven't won any Oscars, by the way, sorry, I don't have that. Showing me up, Mia. Oh, and so we also believe that inclusion isn't a challenge, but is our greatest opportunity. So there's a real breadth of talent and voice and ways in which we can use the voices and perspectives of people to just increase everything that we do and make everything more creatively rich and vibrant. Okay. So I'm not going to sugarcoat it. As you will be aware, there are challenges in that work. It's not simple. And I'm sure a lot of these challenges will be the same for your context as well. But so we have a mostly freelance industry in the UK. There's no policy, there's no HR. There's a very sort of not joined up approach to the way that we do things and processes. And that creates a problem in creating consistent behaviours, in standardisation across the entire sector. And so people are doing things very differently in very different places. And the BFI isn't a regulator, so we can only ask very nicely and show by example what we're doing. We can't really make anybody do anything unless they're coming through our funding. So we can pull the levers that we have as an institution to make people kind of partake in the culture and the behaviours that we want to see in the industry. We have links to government, so that can be helpful or not, depending on where you are, but it allows us to have that conversation about things that we'd like to see change in legislation. For example, in the Equality Act, there are very specific protections for freelancers which have been switched off over the years, and so we often advocate for that in our conversations with them, that they should be switched on and would help us to do this work. And also constantly asking for more money, as aren't we all? Also, in terms of monitoring, it's very difficult to understand where we need to go if we don't understand where we're at. Data is a problem. There's very little consistency, as I've said, across the industry, and so that goes for data as well. We just don't really know who we have or where we have them. So during the pandemic, government asked us how many freelancers were working in film in the UK, and we all sort of went, 85,000? Don't actually know. So that's a real issue in terms of trying to sort of actively push the dial and understand whether we're successful at doing that or not. Also, in terms of trust, because it's a freelance industry, it's built on handshake deals, coffee shop hires, so people are very used to working on their reputation. There's very little security for freelancers, so it's very difficult to sort of build that trust and allow people to give us their data or disclose things about themselves so that we can understand that makeup, because they don't always feel safe doing so or haven't felt safe doing so previously. There's also a knowledge deficit in terms of that data, but also in terms of leadership skills. Often people have built up in independent film, especially production companies, because they really love film and they love making stuff and stories, but they're not necessarily trained in kind of HR or legislation. And so there's a gap in terms of hiring practice and those sort of things that makes it able to be equal across the board. And if we can't talk about, also just in terms of language in diversity, so if we can't talk about diversity and inclusion, or we don't have the language to speak about it, it's really difficult to move that on or change it. And also finite resources. If you think about what we're trying to do in the work of diversity and inclusion, it is to include everybody. So that is the majority of people who aren't. It's a very small minority of people that overlook our entire industry. So we're trying to let everybody else in. That is a big job, and we have finite resources to do it. So it's really around kind of where being consistent, as I was saying, like driving that work forward always to try and embed it in everything that we do, and also trying to remain focused on the most significant interventions, which is why currently we have a race equality lead and a disability equality lead, because we just don't feel like that dial is moving as fast as we'd like it to. Oh, no. Okay, so how do we do this? So we're not interested in interventions and schemes that kind of roll up. We've done this over the history of film, where we do one thing for a year and sort of think, oh, well, that's not really worked, so we'll just move on and we'll do something else. We're interested in long-term change agents, which can be adapted and improved over time, that we can report on. We don't want to keep throwing things on the bonfire of good intention and not actually shifting the dial. So we're interested in the diversification of the workforce, which the standards help us with. I'll move on to those in a minute. So really that's about representation on and off screen, but also behaviours. We have a real problem with retention in our industry because people get treated badly or get discriminated against. And again, that's adding to our problems in our workforce. So we also have a policy that's the prevention of bullying, harassment and racism, which is a contractual agreement on all of our funds, outlining how we expect people to be treated and the legislation that people need to adhere to when they're hiring people. Data accountability and reporting, as I've spoken about, if there's no accountability for the work that we're doing, then how do we know that it's really working? So I'm really interested in reporting on the work that we're doing, seeing whether that's working, and where it isn't working, shifting what we do as opposed to throwing it away. We adjust that policy based on evidence and move forward and see how we go. This work is failure. You're often trying, it's innovative. You're trying new things to solve problems that have been around for a long time. So we shouldn't be afraid of that. We just need to keep checking in and check that that is happening. As I talked about access and accessibility, that is about our physical buildings, but also thinking about our regions and nations, who has access to the things that we provide, socioeconomic background, who can afford the things that we provide, all of that sort of thing. And we really believe in partnership. So the disability community has a saying, nothing about us without us. And we really adhere to that in all the work that we do. So we have really reach out to communities and the work that they're doing and try and frame our work around what is useful to them and the best way to do that. So that includes consulting them on our language, on preferred terms, on what our targets should be, all of that sort of thing. We have a lot of conversations with people in communities, and also have a few screen advisory groups. So these are around stereotypes and representations on screen that are damaging and not great, that we don't want to partake in our film fund. Our most developed one of that is our disability advisory group, who are very loud and very angry and incredibly useful, because they tell us a lot about things that we're doing that we shouldn't, or and inform a lot of our policy. So we've just set up a disability representation panel with them. So they will look at the films that we're funding in our audience fund if there are problematic representations of disability in that, and we have not funded films or distributed films which have problematic representation in them on their advice, because we don't want to alienate them as an audience as well. So that's an incredibly useful conversation, and we try and replicate that across the board. And then it's become increasingly difficult to tell people what to do externally if we don't have our own house in order. So just recently, we have a bigger focus on our internal culture. There's been a lot of changes at the BFI. We've got a new CEO, lots of movement, and that culture is loosening up, and we're kind of fully embedded. We sit under the CEO in the organisation, fully embedded across that work and how we can do that work in the most authentic and useful way. So just to go back to the standards very briefly, we have a workshop later, so just a little advertisement for that if you want to know more. But our standards, we started to use them on our funds in 2016. They were something a little bit different before, called the 3 ticks, which sounded a bit too tick boxy. So we moved them onto the standards in 2016. They are a funding requirement across all of our funds. So anybody that is applying to get money for us must meet the standards as well. So you can see them here. They run across the pipeline of a project, and we have things like an audience fund as well. So that's why audience development is in there, looking at festivals, looking at distribution, that kind of thing. So they're really a guide to change your behaviour. They're hopefully not a tick box exercise. It is about how you do things differently, how you embed this work from the moment that you can, while you're planning, before you're too busy, before you don't have any budget left. How can you use this framework to think about how you do things differently, to think about casting differently, whether your story is authentic or not, whether you have enough diversity in front of and behind the camera. So that's what they do. They've started very much as an internal framework, but have been adapted across the board. So as Mia was talking about, they have them on the BAFTAs, on the British Independent Film Awards, AMPAS standards on the Oscars are a version of our standards. So they're being used across theatre, advertising, in places that we don't always even hear about. So it was clear that people needed something to kind of begin this work, and we hope to sort of grow them and improve them over time as well. So I just wanted to leave you with a bit of joy. So this is a school that were just told that they were going to be taken to see the Black Panther movie a few years ago. And I just wanted to show you this because, A, it's completely joyful and I could watch it on loop for days, but also just shows you how important it is for people to be represented and how important it is to do this work. So. I'll stop it there. Thank you. Thanks very much. Thank you.